And so in today's speaker event, we're going to be hearing from guest speaker Marta Kosmyna. And Marta is a technology policy researcher and a human rights advocate. She's an expert on tech ethics and the use of artificial intelligence in warfare and law enforcement. Marta has testified at the United Nations and spoke at 12 conferences on technology and human rights around the United States. She previously served as the Silicon Valley lead for the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, where she advised engineers and roboticists on the ethical consequences of AI in warfare and policing, and the human rights implications of developing tech for government, military, and law enforcement use. She's also worked at the Human Rights Watch, the Institute for the Study of War, and the Ohio House of Representatives. If you want more information on what she does, you can go to martakosmyna.com. And so with that, Marta.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Ria. I am so excited to talk to all of you. Thank you to all our brave video participants. Show off all your bedhead and all that. I'm super excited to be talking to all of you. We tried to make this happen earlier this year in person, but this is our next best thing. My room is really messy, so I'm actually in a cafe in Paris right now instead, perks of Zoom. So today I want to talk about how good robots go bad. And I want to actually start it off with a poll. And I'm curious if you're part of MSET, maybe you're not, maybe you can think about it in a different context. But our first poll, hopefully everyone can see it right now. I want to ask, has your robot ever malfunctioned during a challenge or a competition that you've been a part of? Did everything go according to plan? Did you have a technical malfunction? Did you have something go wrong? Did you witness something go wrong? Or are you just a winner? You're stunning, and all of your competitions thus far have been successful, in which case I applaud you very much. So give you guys some time. Got 80% of folks have voted, maybe 5 more seconds. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end polling. So do your last entries. And you should be able to see the results right now. So we had 36 people vote, and 94% of you have said that something has gone awry. We all know this feeling when technology malfunctions, whether it's our computer crashing and we lose a project or our GPS leading us astray. We can think of countless examples of when we had good intentions, but things didn't quite go the way we wanted them to. So basically, I look at the high stakes, high risk situations when robots are used by law enforcement, so police or government agencies like immigration or criminal justice system or militaries. I'll mostly talk about everything based in the US context right now, since we're all based in the US. But this is a problem of technology and human rights that can be applicable to any country, and a lot of different countries and engineers and people from all over the world are grappling with issues of technology and ethics and human rights. I'm going to do one more poll just to see where we're coming from. Have the same, just a few minutes to give you one more question. I want to know, have you heard the term killer robots before in any context? Got about 70% of people have voted. Those are quick, I love this. All right, maybe 5 more seconds. Anyone else? All right, and I'll go ahead and share the results. So we've got about 2/3 of folks have heard the term before. So when I say killer robots, what I'm talking about are fully autonomous weapons. So I'm talking about systems that are designed to cause harm, injury, and essentially designed to kill. I'm not going to be talking about autonomous vehicles which may accidentally injure or harm someone, mostly because those systems are not designed to harm. A lot of kind of the ethics considerations and the human rights considerations will cross over. But most of the things I will talk about are robots that are designed to be used by law enforcement and by militaries. All right, so basically I met Ria at a Women in Robotics conference. I was there because I was working with this campaign to stop killer robots, which is a really cool organization. It's about 165 organizations that work in coalition across 65 countries. And their sole goal is to prevent the development of fully autonomous weapons or killer robots. So they're working on creating legislation at the United Nations that all countries will be a part of to ban killer robots. And so my role as Silicon Valley lead last year was to go around and talk to AI experts, whether they're engineers, computer scientists, roboticists. I talked to Google workers who led protests against Google developing weapons and against defense contracts at the company that were very successful. I talked to investors and venture capital folks who work with startups that are developing kind of cutting edge technologies that might have law enforcement or military applications, about how to do that ethically and make sure they don't invest their money in a product that might eventually be banned. I talked to hackers at DEF CON and gave a big presentation there, which is a computer security conference that happens in Las Vegas. And I talked to diplomats at the United Nations. My role was really to educate people on what killer robots are, what the dangers are, how we can prevent them. And basically, we all have a role to play in preventing the development of robots that have gone over to the dark side. One of my favorite parts of my job was actually talking to students who were concerned about the irresponsible development of technology that trampled on their human rights or that of their fellow students and citizens. So I know a lot of you are from the STEM field, but I'd like to ask you if you could access your keyboards and in the chat box, give me some examples of human rights. So just throw them in the chat so everyone can see. If you want some inspiration, no need to Google this. This is just a brainstorm. I'll read some out loud. We've got freedom of speech, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right to speak up, use our voice, basic freedom, speech, religious freedom, freedom to petition, speedy trial, voting. Yes, yeah, think of things like the Bill of Rights, or there's a United Nations document called the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yep, free press, right to assemble. These are amazing. You guys are experts. I don't know what I'm doing here. No, just kidding. Yeah, these are all great. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm really inspired by students, especially when you're already so on top of these topics, because you're the future. What we do, I consider myself as part of the youth movement, and we'll determine what the next 10, 20 years looks like. And it's going to take all of us to build a future that we're proud of, which means using our voice and making decisions, being leaders, and creating positive change. And so I'm really excited to talk to all of you. One thing that I noticed in my work was that a lot of the roboticists and engineers I was working with, they all had really good intentions. When they were thinking of a project or a product or a system, they really had good intentions, but oftentimes they weren't able to think through kind of all the unintended consequences that could potentially affect our human rights down the road. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through some examples of robots gone amok, or robots used for not their original intended purpose. And I'll run through these kind of in a classroom format, give you some history and background, and then I'm going to talk about what we can do as citizens, as students, as eventual college students, maybe as engineers working at startups, working at big tech companies, to really ensure that we're building robots that we're proud of. So to start off, let's see if we can to try to do some slides via this virtual background. Bear with me real quick. All right, maybe. Maybe I'll go smoother the next round. Okay. All right, can you guys all see that? My face really big and awkward. Let's get it back a little bit. So the first example I want to go through is, let's say you're the founder of a startup. You got two of your best friends. You guys hate doing chores, so you're going to create a vacuum, so you never have to vacuum your house again. You're going to name it iRobot, and you're going to build the Roomba, which is a direct-to-consumer robotics product. Seems pretty non-ominous. So you develop your robot, and what you don't know is that it's going to take you 10 years until you can actually commercialize the product and put it on store shelves and have consumers buy it. In that time, you run out of money. And so when you're looking for money, you find a defense contract where essentially you can use the robotic platform that you've already created and you sell it to the military, and you slightly modify the product and you call it PackBot. This is also a robotic platform that can go into dangerous or hazardous areas, and it's used to clear landmines and other unexploded bombs in war zones. And it's used for good, and it saves soldiers' lives. What happens oftentimes is that technology used by militaries trickles down to domestic law enforcement and police agencies. So right now, there are 200 police agencies in the United States that own this robot that was originally created for the military. And in 2016, this robot, essentially there was a shootout between a sniper and police. 5 police officers died, and the police strapped explosives to this robotic platform that you can see. That's not, oh, there we go. It's not exactly this one, but essentially strapped explosives to the side, and they navigated the robot to the shooter, active shooter, and they detonated it, and they killed the shooter. So this was the first kind of known use of a semi-autonomous robotic system to kill a US citizen on US soil. And while the courts later ruled that justified, we have to think about what it means to normalize machines taking human life, because oftentimes something that seems novel and new can become normalized. And so here we talk about rights like our right to life and our right to due process. In that case, the courts ruled it was not possible to detain the suspect, bring him into court, and prosecute him and potentially put him in jail. So this has only happened once, but there's not really policies in place to kind of mitigate for this. And it was a very kind of novel use of robotics in law enforcement. Another example that you probably know is Boston Dynamics Spot robot, which anytime it comes to a robotics conference, everyone loves and gathers around and takes pictures. And all of these systems are semi-autonomous. So I'm talking about current systems, current examples, situations engineers found themselves in, original use cases, and how those companies pivoted towards uses for military and law enforcement purposes. So Spot is an interesting example because originally created to stock shelves in factories, to scout construction sites, go into hazardous areas. But one of the things they did well is originally when they created the system is they would only lease it to customers. So if customers went against the terms of service, they could actually pull their use of their system. So let's say you weaponized the Boston Dynamics Spot robot, they would pull your use of it. They did sell it to police agencies that used it in kind of home raids where Spot's kind of arm protruded and it was able to open doors and go into houses that, you know, they had a warrant for this. But I want you to imagine as, you know, someone that's in their house and you see that walk through your front door. And how does that change policing? How does it change our relationship to technology and to law enforcement? And that was kind of like a big public change where you can see Spot the robot patrolling parks, patrolling areas. There was, I don't know if anyone has seen Black Mirror, there's an episode in there about these kind of scary autonomous dogs that outlive humans and they're weaponized and they run amok. So a lot of these systems have the potential to be used in a very damaging way. So Spot, point this way, Spot actually was used in a way where the company created terms that would not allow it to be weaponized. They also were acquired by SoftBank, and SoftBank has said that they will not allow any of their companies to develop fully autonomous weapons. So by stating that as a company, they're able to be held accountable and people are able to hold them to their word. That's really important. One of the things that we need to see more of is companies being very clear about how their robotic systems will and will not be used. This builds public trust. Another example right next to it is the Nightscope K5 robot, which was also kind of built to patrol everything from casinos to parking lots to malls to parks. And it's pretty large. It's about as tall as maybe any of us. And there was a case in California, actually, where a fight broke out in a public park and this robot was patrolling the park. And there's a button on it that can be pushed that, you know, sounds like emergency. And this robot, as you can see, it has police written really large on it. So a woman witnessed a fight break out at a park and she ran up to the robot, which was patrolling the area. She pressed the emergency response button over and over and over again, and nothing happened. She equated, you know, the robot with an actual police officer. She thought if she pushed the button, it would essentially be like a 911 call where police would send backup. What actually happened is the robot was connected to Nightscope, the company. So an alert went out to a company that was not monitoring the robot's video at all. And what happened is the woman had actually pick up her phone and call 911. People were injured, but the cops showed up eventually. So this is a big case where both overtrust of machines and mistrust of machines becomes an issue, where when you see something that has police written on it, you expect it to have some sort of connection to law enforcement. And while the machine was leased to a police department, in no way was it connected to the emergency response for it. So once you have this overtrust of machines and you expect them to act in a certain way because you saw it in a movie or you saw it in a promotional materials, or it was just part of kind of our general understanding of how things work, and it doesn't work, you also develop a mistrust of machines. So if you launch a product or a project and it doesn't behave as expected and it has negative consequences, not only for your image as a company and from a public relations standpoint, but really the public begins to mistrust machines in a way that can harm positive applications of it. That's why it's important to prevent kind of malfunction before you launch something into the real world. And think about this robot as, you know, whether it's Spot or the K5, if it has a way to detain a person, if, you know, you just attach a robotic arm to it, what does that mean for our right to not be arbitrarily arrested and against our right against cruel and unusual punishment? While none of this has happened, there aren't laws really preventing it from happening, which is the problem. Right now, we have technology moving at breakneck pace, but we don't have policy in place and our policymakers in Congress, at the United Nations, and our state governments aren't able to kind of keep up with the pace of technological progress. And that's where we run into issues. I'll give you another example where in South Korea, a robot was developed to guard the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, between North and South Korea, and that would be the Sentry Weapon. Essentially, it replaced border guards on that zone, and it was deployed in fully autonomous mode. This was back in 2006. And so it used object recognition and thermal imaging to detect any animals or people crossing that zone, and was able to shoot to kill fully autonomously. And what they didn't really think through before they deployed this weapon is that they could also potentially injure or kill a refugee, where the DMZ is one of only 2 land borders where refugees can escape the North Korean regime to safety in South Korea. So there was international outcry and pushback, and this weapon was successfully switched to a semi-autonomous mode where a human has to make a visual ID on whatever it identifies before the weapon can be deployed. And this is really important because according to the rules of warfare, distinction is a really important element where a human soldier must be able to tell who is a combatant and who is a civilian, because you can't just kind of deploy something against civilians or combatants. And it's going to be very hard for machine to be able to tell the difference, especially when you think about the engineers that are involved in the development of these systems. They might not have a great understanding of where these systems will be deployed. Oftentimes in war zones, it is legal to shoot to kill any male over the age of 18 that is in an area of active hostilities. Now, human soldiers are able to distinguish much better between who is a combatant and who is a civilian, so that when you're operating in an area, you can actually make that distinction that's required by international law. But machines aren't really equipped to do so. Another example, I don't have an image for it, but say you're an engineer and you're working at Microsoft, you just got your dream job. You're working in the gaming industry where you've created this augmented reality headset that's really cool. It's going to change the future of gaming. And what happens is it's super successful, you launch it, and a university contacts you and they say, hey, can we use that headset to train our surgeons so they can conduct virtual surgeries and train on the system? And you say, sure. And then the US Army contacts you and they say, hey, can we use your augmented reality headset to train our soldiers in a virtual environment? So instead of going into an obstacle course or instead of going into, before they go into battle, you're training in a virtual environment, which sounds good. But then as you read through the contract, what you notice is it tells you the intention of where they want the product to go. And in your contract with the Army, it says the purpose of the headset will be to increase soldier lethality. And oftentimes this is code for incorporating a system into a weapon, which basically means that the augmented reality headset will become a part of a weapon system. So you can think of the headset as identifying an object or a person and being connected to a smart weapon. A lot of weapons have smart capabilities now, but having that connection essentially puts your product as part of this kill chain decision where it could be used in training, but it could also be used in combat, and nothing that's part of your work with the Army prevents that. So what happens there is you have a risk of kind of gamifying war, where you have a soldier who honestly are our age. They're young. They could be, in the ROTC, they could be in high school, they could be in college. And so you have people that are, they're used to playing video games, and now they're actually in battle and combat, and they have a hard time kind of, you blur this line between what's real and what's kind of a game. And while that distinction gets blurred, you can also have severe PTSD because deep down you know that what you're doing is real, even though you might not be on the ground in warfare. Right now, a lot of warfare happens more remotely, where you have like a drone operator who's essentially looking at a screen and is thousands of miles away from maybe the target they're aiming at. And it really changes the nature of warfare. And a lot of these systems, you know, they're tested in like a controlled lab environment. And when they enter real world urban combat, you get these mistakes that we all experience in our lives and in our competitions and our challenges where things go wrong. But in this case, it's not just a case study, it's actually a life and death situation. Like I said, high stakes, high risk kind of environment. And this headset that was originally created for, you know, video game is kind of going against the original intentions of the engineers. So say you have a Somali software developer that works on that project, and they were really excited to work in gaming, and they find out that the product was used by the US military to drop bombs in Somalia, which is an active combat area for the US military. I think that infringes on our rights as people to know where our work is going and to know how it will be used. And it goes kind of against the original grain of what you were intending to do. So that was just a few examples of different systems. I know it's kind of heavy, but a lot of times these systems are developed and then used in different ways. So when we think about what we can do, we have to think about all technology that we create is dual use or multi-use. Companies can pivot from anything from agricultural technology to IoT devices, gaming, working on mobility, robotics that can be used for law enforcement and military use. And we really need to think about the ethics and the human rights before we even start a project or develop a product. As students, I think it's important for us to ask questions about how our work will be used. Don't accept the status quo. Don't feel like it's hard to change something, or you know, the momentum towards something is it's not possible to stop. You can ask questions. You can question, you know, if you're working on a project, especially, you know, as you maybe go to university and take on internships, as you look for your dream job, who your client will be for projects, and ask like, what is the purpose or the end use of this? You can specify, you can use your voice and ask for these systems not to be used in warfare, not to be used, not to be weaponized. I think it's really important, and we all have a voice in that. I think in university, one thing that's really important is to go through some sort of ethics curriculum as part of maybe like your computer science degree. Some colleges have that already, but some do not. And so as a student, you can actually ask a dean of a university to create a course and make it an elective or make it a required course for all engineers and roboticists to go through, so that you can work as a team and think through some of these issues. It's important to organize, and I think if you're part of MSAT, you know the importance of working as a team and cultivating community, kind of being intentional about the people you surround yourself with, and being able to talk to your fellow students, or in the future your fellow colleagues, about, okay, this thing that you want to do is actually kind of problematic. Like, can you help them think through kind of the potential use cases of whatever they're thinking of developing. I think, you know, it's important to consider who your sponsors are, or the sponsors of events that you go to, especially if you see defense contractors. There's famous ones like Raytheon or Lockheed Martin. who really target universities and schools and STEM clubs, quite frankly, because they are in need of your talent. So you actually have a lot of power in how, in the projects that you do and where you receive your money, which events you go to. One of the most inspiring things I saw when I worked at students with students from Stanford or from Berkeley is they actually would stage protests. They would do sit-ins. They would write letters to their university leadership or to Congress. They would hand out flyers to students, educating them on how, you know, their universities are contributing to the militarization of robotics. If they're partnering with military law enforcement agencies, they're essentially looking for new recruits. And these students were really worried about how the technology that they were creating was being used by organizations like Customs and Border Patrol or Immigration and Customs Enforcement to separate families or enable deportations, because technology can kind of decimate human rights at scale and speed. So it's very important to be aware of how it's being used and to also use our voice, whether we're students in high school or university, or whether we're already adults or we're professors, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a tech worker. And that doesn't always mean being someone that's technical. That can mean working in marketing or HR or whatever. As long as you're part of the company, you can create internal pressure. And there's lots of successful examples of people working together to push for change and kind of building the world that we want to see. So I think I'll leave it at, you know, just because you can build it doesn't mean you should. And I threw a lot at you there. I'd love to open it up to questions now. One thing that I will share just before, you can either unmute yourself and do questions, or you can throw it in the chat box, whichever you prefer. But if this is of interest to you, and if you are like, hell yeah, I support not building killer robots, I want to know more, I want to get involved, don't know where to start, this is what you do. You go to, if I share my screen successfully, there's a website called stopkillerrobots.org/youth, and I'll share my screen so you can see it. Minimize that. Okay, so you can access that at any time. I highly encourage you to check it out after the talk. And this is a page specifically for you. It goes into a little bit more detail about some of the things I talked about. It gives you frequently asked questions about more details. And really what this page does is it is a landing page for anyone that's under the age of 30, kind of flexible, but for you guys to go here and click join the network. And once you get here, again, gives you a little bit more information. You can scroll through and read, but you can actually fill out this form that puts you on a newsletter. But like I said, the campaign has an active network across 65 countries. So we've got students in Latin America, students in Australia, who are thinking of creative ways to raise awareness about the dangers of artificial intelligence and warfare and law enforcement. And they're thinking about kind of the human rights implications of this. We had a school award the campaign this little Peace Prize, which was super important because, again, it raises awareness. We have university students who, like I said, are leading protests and are kind of exposing the connections about how their work as students and their labor and their education is tied to this military industrial complex. They work with Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts across different countries to go to the Jamboree. It was a big event. Oops, sorry. You can access social media, whichever platform you're on, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. There's lots of cool videos where you can learn more about the campaign and how to get involved. And then if you want to be super studious, you can read some publications. There's a report about how universities are connected to killer robots. You can see which tech companies have built systems that contribute to weapons and military work. Or if you're, know some millennials, you can send them that article. But this is a really great landing page where if you want more information, you can check it out. And I am going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to be silent. So if anyone wants to unmute and ask questions.
Hi. So I have a question. Basically, even supposing we do limit our use of AI and machine learning in warfare, what's to stop other countries from doing so in secret or publicly? And then the second part is, could AI or machine learning have any positive ramifications if used for the right reasons?
Yeah, so I'll tackle the first question. I think that's really important, which is why the campaign is working at the United Nations on this, where countries like China, Russia, the US, France, India, pretty much any large military power that you can think of is in the room. And they're actually having these discussions where, what I saw while I was there is that you would have a military lawyer that would come up to another country's military lawyer and they would show notes and they would talk about like, what does autonomy in weapon systems mean? Like what are the existing systems? How do we limit this in a way where we can build mutual trust? And so there are 30 countries already that have committed to seeking this ban. A lot of countries still to convince that are on the fence, but there is a system in place. What we need right now is pressure from the public, from students, from tech workers to really help our policymakers understand how these technical issues sometimes go awry and how we need to kind of create norms at the international level so we can build public trust. One thing I'll share here is that there are other treaties that have banned problematic weapons. You have biological weapons, chemical weapons, blinding lasers, landmines, cluster munitions. And right now we're thinking about when can we ban killer robots? And these treaties were created at the United Nations. The one downside is it was really hard to find the political capital to get countries to sign on to the treaty until the weapon was used. And you saw severe kind of injuries and many people and civilians, especially, these weapons disproportionately affect civilians in combat zones and warfare, where you had to see some catastrophic event and victims before they were banned. And so what the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots is trying to do is we see where technology is headed, the potential downsides of the applications of robotics in militaries and law enforcement. And we want to just come together and say, this is what is allowable. This is what, will protect our human rights. Let's put that into law. The United States actually has, the United States military has a directive which says, if I pull it up here, it says that DoD policy is that autonomous and semi-autonomous weapon systems shall be designed to allow commanders and operators to exercise appropriate levels of human judgment over the use of force. So that is not anything that Congress has written into law. This directive can actually be overturned at any time. Let's say the United States enters a war and they no longer want to uphold this directive. It can be canceled, by a senior general. So what we really need is we need to see our policymakers and our representatives step up and write this into law and more clearly define what appropriate levels of human judgment over the use of force. What does it mean for a robotic system to be under meaningful human control? That's what the campaign is pushing for. There's a lot of initiatives you can see over here from the US government that are asking these questions, that are working on it, but they are very reluctant to create binding policy on these systems, which is why we need citizens and students and tech workers and all those good stakeholders to speak up and use their voice. And then the second question, I believe, was Actually, I totally forgot.
Were there any positive or potentially positive ramifications for incorporating AI and machine learning into warfare?
Yeah, so that was kind of like the example in the beginning where I talked about iRobot, the creators of the Roomba, where they created the PackBot, and it was able, to go into these dangerous areas and clear landmines. The thing is that oftentimes after you sell your technology, especially to a government agency, you lose control or you're not allowed to dictate how it will be used. So what we really need to see more of is laws that curtail negative uses of this technology. And I think the most important part is you need to work with people who are in STEM, students like you, engineers, roboticists, that understand how this technology works. They need to work really closely with policymakers to help them understand how to write a law that doesn't curtail positive uses, right? Positive applications of artificial intelligence and other systems. But right now, what we're seeing with everything from, facial recognition technology, huge pushbacks because it was launched prematurely and it's inaccurate, and its use in the criminal justice system has really harmed real people because it can't detect Black faces, and especially faces of Black women, as well as it can detect faces of white people. So there's things like that. There's things about like voice recognition technology where you have kind of these peaceful uses where we have it in our home, we have it on our cell phones, on our Alexa devices, whatever it may be. But if they're not able to recognize voices of people who have accents or people who may be differently abled, these are kind of the considerations that need to be had before a project is launched, developed, created, all this money is spent. Because once it's already out there, it's already done the harm, and it's really hard to kind of go back from there. And then that public trust in those systems erodes. All right, so what if, I'm reading the chat here, what if non-governmental organizations reach out to you and threatens you to give up your technology? I guess that's actually happened. The campaign is an NGO, and they work on basically talking to tech companies or talking to defense contractors as well and questioning them on the systems that they're using. There was a university in South Korea that they released kind of their research plan, and as part of it, they were going to research autonomous weapons. And quite rightly, the public and the students at that university and other professors around the world were really questioning, how this university research will be used. They made no mention of what partnerships will be had with the military, and if they have any prohibitions on using the fully autonomous weapons to harm people. Academic research doesn't happen in a bubble. And what happened essentially after this university kind of launched their new center, rolling out this policy and this research plan, is there was huge public outcry and pushback where not only the students at that university, but like I said, professors around the world, they did petitions and they wrote letters and they talked to senior leaders at the United Nations, and that university came out with a statement saying, like, I forget what the exact wording was, but it was basically like, our research will not be used for the development of fully autonomous weapons. They made it very clear. And again, once they make that statement, they can be held accountable, and you can actually create a plan on how to make sure that research is used for good. What else? Questions? Someone asked, why are many against banning fully autonomous weapons, considering all the harm they're capable of? Is it similar in theory to why nuclear weapons aren't completely banned? Yeah, so the campaign to stop killer robots, they did a poll where they found that 61% of the public is for banning fully autonomous weapons. And this was really important to show that the majority of people supported it. And quite frankly, the countries that are kind of the most well known for being part of arms races, whether that's Russia or China or the US, the public in those, the citizens of those countries were really against the development of these systems. I think some arguments I've heard are that, that it's too early to regulate this technology because we don't know what will happen or where it will end up. And that again goes back to policymakers need to work with tech experts to help them kind of configure what the legislation should look like so that you can use it for positive use cases and not kind of have it for positive applications of the technology. What else? Other reasons people are against it, they talk about, these systems will actually, save lives and be more precise, which they've said about pretty much every weapon ever created, which includes things like landmines and cluster munitions that have already been banned, basically because sometimes what happens is these systems are banned and not all countries sign on to the treaty. So for example, the US has signed on to the Convention Against Landmines, I hope I said that right, they haven't signed on, but they adhere to a lot of its obligations. So the only place the US uses landmines right now is in the demilitarized zone between South Korea and North Korea. So what happens is this treaty creates a norm that even countries who don't adhere to the treaty are now kind of pressured because there's this international norm against this weapon. And that's really important because since that treaty has been adopted, I can't remember how many countries, it's over 100 countries have adopted it at this point. The stockpile of those problematic weapons that harm so many more civilians than actual soldier combatants, those stockpiles of those weapons have been destroyed. And like millions of landmines have been destroyed. And also you have a forum that builds public trust between these countries because you now have a treaty body that countries can gather around, and countless lives have been saved by those landmines not being used and laid. So that's really important. Let me look for more questions. How do you see the use of AI and machine learning in 20 years? Specifically in military applications, that's my expertise, so that's what I can talk to. I show one more slide. There's these unmanned aerial vehicles, which you might more commonly know as an armed drone, which again is a semi-autonomous system. It's still piloted by a human operator. What we're trying to prevent is this fully autonomous system that kind of uses everything from computer vision to deep learning. So many of the systems that you might develop as a roboticist can be incorporated into weapons, but it's really, a system is just the sum of its parts. So you need to understand kind of the other applications and how those parts come together, especially when it comes to military and law enforcement use. But for example, these were created essentially for military surveillance. So just to overlook an area and conduct reconnaissance missions. And within 10 years, they were weaponized. They were armed and they were used to drop bombs on countries thousands of miles away. So that's what happens within 10 years. And then just this year, actually, a Reaper drone flew over a Black Lives Matter protest and monitored protesters. And that was through, I believe, Customs and Border Patrol, an agency that operates within US borders, has access to these military systems and is actively using them in the United States. So when it comes to like understanding how these systems trickle down and how they're used, I want you to think about that time frame where essentially, you can develop a robotic system for a consumer market in maybe 10 years. And 10 years from that, they become much, much more sophisticated. So really, we're thinking about the long-term game, about if these systems are developed successfully and they work well, so we're normalizing a machine taking a human life. And what does that mean? Or these systems being developed and malfunctioning and not working well, and that also being problematic. So in my view, whether the systems that are developed, essentially if they work, they're problematic. If they don't work, they're also problematic, which is why we need to ask these questions early, and we need to kind of not follow Silicon Valley, move fast, break things mentality when it comes to these high risk, high stakes decisions, because you really need to pause, take a step back, ask questions, and start thinking very seriously about the human rights implications of these. Lots of questions. What influenced you into becoming an advocate for tech policies that protect human rights and go into this field related to ethics of AI? I did a lot of research on basically civilian protection in conflict zones. I'm a first generation American and I spoke Ukrainian. So when the war broke out between Ukraine and Russia, I was looking at weapons used in Ukraine and the effect they had on civilians, how weapons went from just a small combat zone and proliferated to other countries and other areas. And then I got my dream job at Human Rights Watch, and I was looking at Russian involvement in Syria and cluster munitions that were dropped on civilians in Syria. And I was seeing how no matter how advanced these smart weapons were, they were disproportionately affecting civilians. And I saw, as someone who's a millennial and sees technology in every aspect of my life and is very comfortable with it, I saw the role that tech workers have in developing these systems, where they're developed for consumers or for the public market, but actually the same technology that powers the systems that you've seen on my slides can be used in weapons. And a lot of the conversations that were happening, we talk about tech for good, we talk about ethics and artificial intelligence, we talk about human rights, but like, what does that actually mean? And I think in the past, maybe 2-3 years, companies have actually been hiring people to work with engineers, to work with developers on considering these questions before a system is even developed. And I was very lucky, I kept pushing my bosses at Human Rights Watch, who are a part of this campaign to stop killer robots, to go out to Silicon Valley, to go to other tech hubs around the world, and to actually talk to the people developing the technology that we're concerned about. And they said, if you're so passionate about it, go out and do it. And so I did. And I can't do that in person anymore, but still get to do that virtually. So very excited. What else we got? A similar question. What about fighter jets and heat-seeking weapons? What about army drones? Would you consider these as autonomous weapons? Yeah, so the systems you see here are autonomous weapons. They're semi-autonomous, which means they're either piloted by a human operator, or there's a human it's called human in the loop system. What I'm more concerned about is what happens when the systems become good enough to navigate autonomously. What happens when you use, I can't really see it because my face is in front of it, but this is like a loitering munition. Basically, think about this drone that can hover and be refueled autonomously, or it's solar powered or something, where it never runs out of, it never needs to land. And it can hunt you to the ends of the earth. So whether you commit a crime or whether some country determines that you're a terrorist, we've seen countries basically prosecute activists, prosecute journalists, prosecute political dissidents. What does it mean to be an enemy of the state when you're constantly surveilled and you can actually launch a weapon that will autonomously search for you, whether it's using things like facial recognition technology, or, you know, in the medical field, they've developed, they can actually identify humans based on their heartbeat signature. So you can't change your face. You can't change your heartbeat. You can't change your gait. There's a lot of gait detection. I think these systems are becoming very powerful, and right now that they're at these very nascent stages where they don't work well, so they're not really used. But the intention of militaries and of law enforcement agencies is to deploy them. And when I see this future, it's a little too Black Mirror, a little too dystopian for me. I think it's really important to protect our basic right to life, our right to due process, protect the laws of war, which mean that you have to be proportionate in your military operations. You have to distinguish between a civilian and a combatant. These are rights that are really hard to ingrain into a machine. Machines are not moral actors. I don't think you'll ever be able to program a robot that will actually be able to respect our rights. More questions? Have you ever come across someone? I know we're at an hour, so are we okay to keep going, Ria?
Yeah, for sure. Keep going.
Okay. If anyone needs to drop off, thank you for tuning in. I hope I get to all your questions. So have you ever come across someone with completely opposite beliefs to yours, like someone who thinks it's harmful to limit tech and military research in any way? Yes. There's a lot of partnerships between Silicon Valley and the Defense Department. I've worked with a lot of everyone from universities to journalists to tech workers, and everyone has a different opinion. Oftentimes it's really easy to talk about ethics in like a philosophical way, or to kind of think about it hypothetically. But for me, it really comes down to humanizing this. And what we're really talking about, again, is machines taking a human life. And are we okay with that? What does that mean for our moral and ethics, our personal moral and ethics? And I would say from kind of the folks that I've talked to that are within the Department of Defense, they're really split. There's some people who agree with me 100%. They're working as hard as they can and putting themselves in being leaders and making decisions that will kind of protect human rights, because it's not like war inherently is violent. You're never going to have a war where you can kind of send robots into an uninhabited place and the robots will, it's not like battle bots, you know, you can't just battle it out and the countries say, okay, like you won. War comes to like your doorstep. It's in urban areas, it's messy, civilians are involved. There's no way to kind of make war more precise and more clean, which I think is the intention of these weapons, but how they're used in reality is that, you know, thousands of bombs are dropped in countries on behalf of US taxpayers. Thousands of civilians are injured each year, and everywhere the US is involved in active combat operations. I think it's, so like I said, the military is split. There's some people that are on board. There's some new initiatives that I think I pulled up earlier where these groups are discussing ethics, but they haven't really made any determinations on fully autonomous weapons beyond this policy from 2012, which was the Obama administration. So we really need them to do more. And the concern is, while there are good actors within the Department of Defense, there are also people who I would call like hawks, and they are all about getting more money to military contractors and the Department of Defense to develop weapons that the United States would have in their arsenal, just in case. Like, the US military uses artificial intelligence in weapons already. There really isn't a need to develop fully autonomous weapons or killer robots. They have a lot of capabilities that allow them to have, more precision and to have what they call human-machine teaming, to have more precise strikes and all the benefits that you would see from AI in warfare. But they're still pushing for this full autonomy that could not only be harmful to civilians, it could, if a system malfunctions, it could cause injury or kill friendly soldiers. It could, a lot of commanders that I've talked to, they're not comfortable deploying these systems of untested technologies or technologies that have only been tested in a lab in this kind of complicated war environment, because quite frankly, if it malfunctions and one of their soldiers loses their lives, or like an allied soldier loses their life, they're not okay with a machine taking a human life, and they've kind of put their foot down. So, for example, if there's a system that can be used in a kind of very autonomous way, they will actually run the system in a kind of like a safer mode where they have more control over the decision making of the system. The hard part is that oftentimes you have a system like an air defense system. Here, I'll show you a picture. That honestly, you just have seconds to make a decision, where a computer algorithm identifies a missile coming your way. Say you're on a big military ship in an area where there's a lot of active hostilities, and it detects an incoming missile. A soldier has about 3 seconds to say, yes, I agree with the machine, push the button to launch a counter missile, right? So what does that mean for like meaningful human decision making? Yes, that is technically still a semi-autonomous weapon because there's a human confirming the incoming missile, but you have seconds to do that. And when it comes to, I think someone mentioned nuclear weapons in the chat box, there was actually, I'll give you a little story where during the Cold War, there was a Russian commander who was in a submarine, I don't remember which ocean he was in, but essentially his computer systems were telling him that the US has launched ballistic nuclear tipped missiles at Russia, and he had to decide whether he wants to counterattack and launch nuclear weapons from Russia against the United States. The computer was telling him that these missiles had been launched. He was in a submarine, so he wasn't able to like contact a senior commander on land to confirm the launch. So he had to make a decision to trust the computer or to essentially trust his gut, which from like all the military intelligence he had, it wouldn't make sense at all for the US to launch these nuclear missiles. And the Russian commander didn't launch. He essentially like prevented a nuclear war, which as one person kind of lets you know kind of the power that you have in the decisions that you make, and especially if you're in a leadership position. In not trusting the computer and making a human judgment, if that human was not in the loop, that computer would have just counter launched those missiles, and then there'd be a nuclear war. Like, this is a real example. This stuff happens. Okay, let's see what else. There's obviously a lot of political turmoil around the world and a lot of conflict between civilian populations and law enforcement, both in major cities in the US and internationally in places like Hong Kong and Belarus. How do you think the development of robotics and AI in these fields could impact conflicts like this? This one's really close to my heart because I've studied, protests in other countries, and I've seen how authoritarian regimes react when faced with their own citizens revolting, and it's not good. Oftentimes, you'll see cops or National Guard soldiers or anyone using these less than lethal munitions, which is kind of like, think of it as like pepper spray or rubber bullets. It's intended to harm you, but not kill you. But these weapons are often not used properly to the point where they cause lasting injuries to protesters, which we've seen, like you mentioned, in Belarus, United States. I saw it in Ukraine when I was doing research. What happens oftentimes is that when you have a line of police and you have a line of protesters, that's a human-to-human interaction. Around the world, you see police lay down their shields, lay down their weapons, and stand with protesters, because what they realize, they have, this human empathy, they have a human moral code and ethics, and quite frankly, killing your fellow citizen when you're sworn to, protect and serve your fellow citizens is like a huge deal. If you had a regime that had access to fully autonomous weapons, think of it as, something like the Spot, the robot, or Nightscope, or any of these systems that I flashed on the screen, and those were weaponized, you can essentially take out that human connection, and you can have one person control an army of many, where you can see much more severe crackdowns and less kind of a democratic process, and definitely infringe on your right to peacefully assemble and freely assemble. Even I think surveillance of protests by these systems, even if they're not weaponized, can have a really chilling effect on free speech and right to assembly, just because, if you go somewhere, maybe you don't want to be identified, maybe you just want to go in solidarity. These systems might identify you in an area where there was a crime that happened and you weren't part of the crime, but because you were just in the general vicinity, you get prosecuted as well. Kind of the de-anonymization of those rights, I think, can have a very chilling effect. Got one more question. If the public got their hands on these weapons, how would we gain control over the public? And do you think the government would stop manufacturing these weapons and compromise their advanced weapons? So when it comes to a fully autonomous weapon, like anyone could develop it right now. Think of it, a paintball gun attached to, think of like the Home Alone situation where you have a paintball gun attached to a door. So if someone enters your house, they get shot with the paintball, or your tree house or whatever. Like a kid could literally make these right now. That would be considered a fully autonomous weapon, because someone would enter the vicinity and the weapon would be deployed in a fully autonomous way. That's like a dumb killer robot. You can make that right now. What I think what militaries are trying to create are kind of, I guess, smarter killer robots. They think that they can create a machine that will be able to comply with the laws of war, which I think is a huge challenge, especially with the state of technology today. They're trying to put controls and into how the system works so that they comply with the laws of war. But I really don't think it's possible. As soon as you remove the human completely, it goes back to all of these rights that we've discussed that would be trampled on. So they're trying to create smarter killer robots, but in the end, it's still a killer robot. And at that point, you have to decide as a citizen, you have to decide as a policymaker, you have to decide as a country, whether that's something that is part of your moral code, whether that's ethical, whether that respects human rights. And for me, it's the answer is unequivocally, it does not. So that's all the questions I have in the chat box. Does anyone want to unmute or ask questions? Or Ria, maybe take over from here.
Yeah, so let's give it another 30 seconds if anyone has any last questions they want to ask. All right, if not, Marta, thank you so much for coming in.